At first light in Jerusalem, men are carrying something out of the temple that should never have been there at all. It is wood, but not only wood. It is a sign, a memory, a promise. For some, it is a scandal. For others, it is a comfort that has stood for generations. The book of 2 Kings says that in the days of Josiah, the image or symbol of Asherah was brought out from the house of the Lord, taken beyond the city, burned, crushed, and scattered. That is not the language of a tidy reform. It is the language of a purge. By the time the smoke rises, this object has already lived many lives. It has stood under trees on village hillsides. It has stood beside altars. It has stood, somehow, in the holiest place of Judah's public faith. And now, it is being ground into dust. The question is not only who Asherah was. The harder question is how a figure once woven into the religious world of the Levant became the name later generations were taught to forget. The Bible remembers her mostly as a threat. It mentions Asherim, often translated as Asherah poles or sacred wooden objects, in lists of things righteous kings cut down and unfaithful kings permit. Prophets rage against shrines on high hills and under green trees. Reformers tear, burn, and break. If we knew Asherah only from those lines, she would appear as little more than a rival brand of worship, one more forbidden cult among many. But history is rarely so simple, and memory, written by the victors, is rarely complete. To understand why the campaign against Asherah became so fierce, we have to step backward into an older religious world, one in which she was not a dark temptation on the edge of faith, but a familiar and even maternal presence in the middle of ordinary life. Long before there was a kingdom of Israel, before Jerusalem was a royal capital, before the temple stood on Zion, the peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean lived with relentless exposure to nature. Rain was not an inconvenience or a pleasant forecast. It was survival. A dry season that stretched too long meant hunger. A failed flock meant ruin. Childbirth was hope shadowed by danger. In such a world, fertility was never an abstract idea. It meant grain in storage, lambs in the fold, a living child at the breast, a family line that did not disappear. Deities connected with fertility, sea, storm, motherhood, and land were not decorative beliefs. They were part of the logic by which people endured uncertainty. That older world comes into view with unusual clarity at Ugarit, the late Bronze Age city on the Syrian coast, whose clay tablets have given scholars a window into Canaanite religion. There, in texts written centuries before the fall of Jerusalem, a goddess appears under the name Athirat, widely identified with the Asherah, known later from Hebrew tradition. In those texts, she is not a minor spirit hidden in the background. She is bound up with the high divine world. She is linked with El, the senior god in the Ugaritic pantheon. She is described in maternal terms. She belongs to a cosmic household. Even now the details remain debated, as details in ancient religion often do, but the broad outline is clear enough. This was not a deity invented at the margins by a few rebels. She belonged to a deep and old religious inheritance across the Levant. That matters, because Israel did not emerge in a vacuum. The people who came to identify themselves with the God of Israel lived in the same hills, used related languages, shared agricultural patterns, and moved within cultural habits older than their political identity. When later biblical writers condemn worship on the high places, under trees, beside pillars, and with carved images, they are not describing exotic imports from another planet. They are describing the religious atmosphere of the land itself. The struggle over Asherah was so intense precisely because she was near. She was not strange. She touched life where life felt most fragile. That is why the story cannot be told honestly as a simple contest between truth and obvious falsehood. For many ordinary people, the attraction of Asherah was not philosophical rebellion, it was practical hope. If a woman prayed for a child, if a family feared a dry year, if a village wanted blessing on field and herd, the appeal of a maternal divine presence would have felt immediate. That is the world behind the wooden symbol carried from the temple in Josiah's day. By then, the battle lines had hardened, and the official theology of Judah was moving toward a fierce exclusivity. But the object in those men's hands carried older fears and older desires. It carried the memory of a time when many people in the land did not experience divine life as solitary and masculine, but as populated, familial, and close to the cycles of the earth. So the story of Asherah begins not with destruction, but with belonging. She was not first remembered as an enemy, she was received as help, and things received as help do not disappear just because a law condemns them. They linger in habit, in households, in village custom, in political compromise, and sometimes, astonishingly, even in the sanctuary itself. That is what makes this story worth following with care. It is not merely the tale of a forgotten goddess. It is the story of how a people fought over the very shape of the divine, and how that fight changed the inner world of biblical faith. Chapter 2. To hear the name Asherah in its older setting, we have to leave behind the later certainty of strict monotheism and enter a landscape where divinity was imagined as a network of powers, relationships, and functions. The ancient Near East was full of gods, because life itself felt distributed across many forces: sky, storm, sea, death, fertility, kingship, war, childbirth, harvest, plague, and healing, all pressed on human beings with a force that seemed greater than chance. Religion arose not only from awe, but from dependence. The gods were the language people used for a world that could nourish and destroy them in the same week. In the texts from Ugarit, Athirat, whom most scholars connect to Asherah, appears beside El, the senior patriarchal deity. The exact shades of her role have been argued over, but she is clearly no passing figure. She belongs to the top level of the divine order. She is maternal, venerable, and closely associated with the production and maintenance of life. Some of the old epithets linked to her have the texture of movement and majesty. She is not simply fertility in the narrow sense of sexuality. She stands nearer to the idea of generative abundance itself, the divine fullness from which a world of living beings keeps coming. If that sounds grand, it should. In agrarian societies, fertility was grand. It was the dividing line between continuity and collapse. The religious life of the Levant did not stay trapped in tablets. It moved through shrines, family customs, ritual objects, and local sanctuaries. It moved in wood and stone more often than in books. That is one reason Asherah is so often associated not with a detailed statue, but with a tree-like cult object, a pole, a carved trunk, or a stylized wooden form planted or set near an altar. In later Hebrew usage, the word Asherah can refer either to the goddess herself or to the symbol associated with her. That ambiguity has shaped the debate ever since. Was a given text condemning a divine figure, a sacred object, or both? In many cases, the answer may be both, because ancient religion did not separate symbol and presence the way modern people often do. A sacred object did not merely remind worshippers of divine power. It marked a place where divine power was expected to be accessible. The tree association matters because trees in the ancient world were not sentimental scenery. A living tree in a dry land was shade, fruit, rootedness, and visible endurance. It reached down and up at once. It held water in secret and life in open branches. A tree, or a carved post, could serve as a fitting sign of the life that comes from hidden sources. Biblical writers later condemn worship under every green tree, and the phrase carries more than annoyance at rural superstition. It points to a whole ritual geography in which elevated places, groves, and standing symbols were experienced as meeting points between heaven, earth, and the hope for blessing. When Israel and Judah eventually appear in the historical record as kingdoms, they emerge within this older religious field, not outside it. The people who would later preserve texts about covenant with one God lived among and against patterns of worship that had been normal in the land for centuries. That means the biblical attack on Asherah is not a fight against something foreign in every sense. It is, in part, an internal struggle over inheritance. Which elements of the Old West Semitic religious world could be absorbed, transformed, or rejected? Which divine titles, symbols, and expectations could remain, and which had to be purged for the worship of the Lord to become exclusive? The answer took a very long time to settle. That is one of the most important historical correctives in this whole story. The final form of biblical faith did not arrive overnight, complete and uncontested. The Hebrew Bible itself preserves traces of conflict, reform, relapse, compromise, and uneven practice across generations. It remembers kings who removed high places and kings who rebuilt them. It remembers centralization and dispersion, reform and corruption. In other words, it remembers a people arguing with itself. In that argument, Asherah represented something profound. She represented the persistence of a religious instinct that many people found natural, the sense that divine care should include a maternal or fertility-bearing presence close to the everyday needs of body and land. That instinct did not vanish when the worship of the Lord took root. It had to be confronted, redefined, and, eventually, condemned. But before it was condemned, it was familiar. It stood in the background of household piety, local sanctuaries, and regional tradition. It helped answer fears that law codes alone could not soothe. When later readers approach Asherah only as a prohibited name in the Bible, they miss that older emotional reality. She was not important because theologians needed a rival concept. She was important because ordinary people needed crops, children, continuity, and a sense that the powers ruling life were not entirely distant. That older need is part of why the pole in the temple became such a scandal. It was not just evidence of bad policy, it was evidence that older religious longings had entered the center of national worship and were proving stubbornly difficult to drive back out. Chapter 3. When the biblical writers describe Israel entering Canaan, they tell the story as a covenant people coming into a land already marked by other gods, other altars, and other loyalties. Historically, the process was more layered than a simple invasion into empty territory. Archaeology and textual study suggest a gradual and complex emergence of Israelite identity within the highlands of Canaan. But whether the process was sudden or slow, one thing is clear. Early Israelite religion developed in close contact with the broader Canaanite religious environment. The distinction between Israelite and Canaanite was not always a bright line at the level of daily practice. That is why the Bible returns so often to the danger of syncretism, though the word itself is modern. In the biblical imagination, the covenant required exclusive loyalty to the Lord. In lived religion, many people did not act as though exclusive loyalty was obvious, easy, or even prudent. They lived in farming villages, depended on rainfall, watched neighboring peoples maintain shrines and rituals tied to the fertility of land, and inherited customs older than the monarchy. A commandment could say one thing. A family facing drought could feel another. The language of the texts shows that Asherah belonged to this tension at more than one level. Sometimes she appears as a named divine power. Sometimes the Asherah looks more like a cultic object that can be planted, cut down, or burned. Deuteronomy forbids planting any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord. Judges, Kings, Chronicles, and the prophets speak of Asherim as things kings tolerate or destroy. Those lines are revealing. They suggest that the worship of the Lord and the presence of Asherah symbols were not always kept in separate worlds. The problem, from the viewpoint of the reforming texts, is precisely that people tried to put them together. That should arrest us. The issue is not simply that some Israelites occasionally abandoned their God for another. The deeper issue is that many seem to have thought the powers could coexist, or that the older fertility symbol could stand beside the altar of the Lord without contradiction. That is a very different religious psychology. It is not a clean apostasy where one camp says yes and the other says no. It is a blending. It is a religion of addition. Pray to the God who brought your ancestors out of Egypt, yes, but also keep near whatever promises rain, conception, safe birth, and a good harvest. Cover every danger. Leave no gate unguarded. For covenant theology, that was intolerable. For ordinary people, it may have felt sensible. That tension runs through the monarchy like a crack through stone. The Bible repeatedly tells us that kings did what was right, except that the high places were not removed. That recurring phrase is easy to skip past, but it reveals a whole political problem. Royal ideology might support the temple in Jerusalem. Priestly teaching might insist on exclusive worship. Yet local shrines and their associated practices continued to draw loyalty. They were near, familiar, and embedded in local life. Reform from the center did not instantly erase devotion at the edges. The household dimension matters too. Official religion is easier to regulate than domestic ritual. A state can tear down a major sanctuary. It cannot easily watch every room, every courtyard, every village hill. Small figurines found in Judah, especially female pillar figurines from the monarchic period, have often been drawn into this conversation, though scholars remain divided about exactly how they were used and whether they should be directly tied to Asherah. Still, the broader picture is suggestive. Female-coded religious symbolism did not vanish from Judahite life simply because elite texts condemned it. Whatever names people used, many households carried hopes and fears that found expression in bodily, maternal, and fertility-related forms. This is where the story becomes less comfortable than later religious memory might prefer. It is possible that for long stretches of Israelite and Judahite history, the everyday religion of many people was not the strict monotheism later readers assume. The final biblical texts press toward that monotheism with tremendous force, but they do so partly because the path to it was contested. Warnings against idols, sacred trees, pillars, and foreign gods would make little sense if the temptation were only imaginary. The repeated need to tear down the Asherim tells us they kept appearing. Someone kept planting them. Someone kept valuing what they represented. And yet the reforming writers did not see this as harmless folk religion. For them, it struck at the heart of covenant identity. If the Lord was God, in a unique and exclusive sense, then divine life could not be parceled out between him and a maternal consort or symbol. If Israel's calling was to bear witness to one God who could not be reduced to nature, then fertility could not be domesticated by ritual trees and local shrines. The whole structure of worship had to shift, from a landscape dense with sacred sites toward a more concentrated and disciplined vision of holiness. That shift would not be painless. It would require legislation, prophecy, royal power, and, eventually, catastrophe. Before catastrophe came, however, there was compromise. There was the village mother who still wanted help. There was the farmer who still feared the sky. There was the king who married for alliance and tolerated foreign rites. There was the priest who looked the other way. There was the shrine on the hill that continued to draw worship even when Jerusalem said otherwise. Asherah survived not because she was invincible, but because she made sense to the instincts of ordinary life in the land. Chapter 4. The most unsettling evidence in this whole story may be a handful of inscriptions scratched far from the controlled language of Scripture. In the late 20th century, discoveries from sites such as Kuntilet Ajrud in the Sinai and Khirbet el-Kom in Judah sharpened a debate that was already alive among historians of Israelite religion. Some inscriptions contain blessing formulas that refer to Yahweh and his Asherah, or wording close enough to that phrase to make scholars argue intensely about what it means. The arguments are technical and they matter. Does his Asherah refer to a goddess, a cult symbol, a shrine-related object, or something else? Is the phrase possessive in the way it seems at first glance, or is the grammar more slippery? There is no honest way to pretend the question is settled in every detail, but there is also no honest way to miss the force of the evidence. These inscriptions suggest that, in some circles of the 9th or 8th century before Christ, people invoking Yahweh could also invoke an Asherah in the same breath. That alone changes the mood of the discussion. It means the contest over Asherah was not merely a battle between Israel and outsiders. It reached into circles that identified themselves with Yahweh. The worship of Israel's God and the presence of Asherah-related devotion were, at least in some places, not experienced as opposites. That possibility helps explain why the biblical reaction becomes so sharp. If Asherah had belonged only to foreigners, the issue would have been easier to define. But if many Israelites and Judahites saw no contradiction in pairing their national god with older fertility symbols, or even with a divine consort, then the entire project of exclusive worship faced a challenge from within. The fiercest wars are often civil in this sense. They are not fought against what is wholly alien, but against what is intimate, persistent, and dangerously plausible. Here the difference between text and archaeology becomes especially revealing. The biblical writers, particularly in the Deuteronomistic history, narrate Israel's past through the lens of covenant fidelity and infidelity. Kings are judged according to whether they removed high places, smashed pillars, and cut down Asherim. The narrative is moral and theological. Archaeology, by contrast, gives us fragments of lived practice without commentary. A blessing, painted on storage jars or inscribed on plaster, does not explain itself. It simply shows that somewhere, someone thought such language made sense. The silence around motive is what makes it powerful. It is a direct glimpse into religion before later editors have interpreted it for us. What kind of person would have written such a blessing? Perhaps a traveler, a soldier, a merchant, a scribe, or a worshipper seeking protection. The point is not the exact identity. The point is that this is not royal theology alone. It is practical religion, everyday religion, portable religion, and everyday religion often preserves older habits longer than official reformers expect. That may be why Asherah appears so resilient across the biblical centuries. A royal decree can change liturgy at the center faster than it changes imagination at the edges. None of this means the Bible is false or archaeology has overturned it. In a way, the opposite is true. The stubborn recurrence of Asherah-like evidence outside the Bible helps confirm the depth of the conflict the Bible remembers. The texts are full of laws against sacred trees, denunciations of high places, and accounts of repeated reforms, because those practices were real and recurring. The world behind the text was noisy, mixed, and unstable. Exclusive worship of one invisible God did not emerge in a smooth line. It had to be argued, enforced, narrated, and defended. This is also where the emotional center of the story grows clearer. If some people spoke of Yahweh and his Asherah, they may not have thought they were betraying the Lord at all. They may have believed they were honoring him in the most complete way they knew, with his power for history and kingship joined to a symbol of life, fertility, and blessing. What reformers saw as corruption, many worshippers may have seen as fullness. That does not make the two positions equally true within biblical theology, but it does explain why the split was so hard to heal. Both sides believed they were protecting life. One side protected continuity with popular need and inherited custom. The other protected the singular holiness of a God who would not be managed through images or paired with any other sacred presence. Once the conflict is understood that way, the violence of later reform becomes easier to comprehend, though not easier to celebrate. The destruction of an Asherah was never merely about removing a piece of wood. It was about severing a whole way of imagining divine care. It was about telling people that the God of Israel would not share space, not even with a maternal sign that seemed to promise blessing. Such a demand was bracing, even brutal. It asked a people to trust that rain, womb, flock, and field were under the command of one God alone, a God who refused the images their neighbors used to make divine life feel close. That trust was the nerve of Israel's emerging monotheism, and it had enemies not only in palaces and treaties, but in the ordinary logic of fear. Chapter 5. The Bible gives the struggle a human face in the age of Ahab and Jezebel. If Asherah was long rooted in the land, Jezebel made the conflict visible at court. She enters the story as a Phoenician princess, daughter of Ethbaal of Sidon, according to later tradition, married into the northern kingdom of Israel for alliance as much as affection. Such marriages were political. They brought trade, security, and influence. They also brought gods. In the ancient world, religion traveled with royalty because power and worship were never far apart. The biblical writers describe Jezebel as a determined patron of Baal and Asherah. 1 Kings 18 speaks of 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. That line alone tells us how fully royal patronage could shape public religion. These were not private devotions hidden in a back room. They were supported from the palace. They had status, visibility, and a place within the machinery of state. The text also says, Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, forcing some into hiding. Obadiah, a servant in Ahab's house, hides 100 prophets in caves and feeds them bread and water. Whatever we make of every detail, the narrative wants us to feel the atmosphere of fear. The issue is no longer local compromise. It is open religious contest tied to the throne. Then comes Carmel, one of the Bible's most dramatic scenes. It is important to notice that the public test on the mountain is staged mainly against the prophets of Baal, not against the prophets of Asherah, though Asherah belongs to the larger court-sponsored religious bloc in the chapter. The challenge is simple and absolute. Let the God who answers by fire be God. Baal, the storm god in Canaanite religion, is being tested in the domain that should favor him. If he rules storm and sky, surely fire from heaven is within his reach. The prophets of Baal call, dance, and cut themselves. Nothing happens. Elijah repairs the altar of the Lord, drenches the sacrifice, and prays. Fire falls. The people cry out that the Lord is God. Then the scene turns hard. Elijah orders the seizure of the prophets of Baal, and they are slaughtered at the Kishon. Modern readers often recoil there, and rightly so. The Bible is not embarrassed by the violence. It places us inside a world where religious conflict is not an exchange of essays, but a struggle bound up with kingship, famine, legitimacy, and life under judgment. To sanitize that world would be dishonest. And yet even Carmel does not end the story. That is one of the most revealing things about it. A miracle, if the text is read on its own terms, does not instantly erase competing devotion. Jezebel remains dangerous. Elijah flees. The structures that allowed mixed worship are still in place. This is not a neat victory, but a flashpoint in a longer war. The attraction of Baal and Asherah does not disappear because one mountain witnessed fire. Habit, fear, and political convenience are stronger than one spectacle. Jezebel herself is worth understanding beyond the easy role of villain. From the biblical viewpoint, her religious program is intolerable, and the text never hides that judgment. But historically, it is not hard to see why a Phoenician royal daughter would support the gods of her own world. Baal and Asherah belong to the wider religious environment of the coastal Levant. Her actions are aggressive in the biblical narrative, but they are not irrational within the politics of the age. What the Bible experiences as apostasy, she might have experienced as proper dynastic religion. That clash of perspectives is exactly what makes the conflict so fierce. Both sides believe public faith must be ordered, not left neutral. The prophetic response is equally uncompromising. Elijah does not propose coexistence. He does not ask for balance. He demands decision. How long will you go limping between two opinions? He asks the people. The image is unforgettable. It suggests a body unable to stand straight because allegiance is split. That is the core accusation, not only against Baal worship, but against all forms of divided devotion, including the kinds of compromise in which Asherah could flourish beside the altar of the Lord. This is why the story of Carmel matters for Asherah, even when she is not the central figure in the showdown itself. The contest clarifies the principle at stake. The God of Israel will not be one power among many. He will not sit inside a pantheon. He will not share public worship with deities or symbols that channel fertility, storm, or royal favor through alternate routes. From this point on, the biblical narrative keeps pressing toward a sharper exclusivity. That pressure will rise and fall with kings, but it will not go away. Still, the very need for repeated confrontation tells us something sobering. Religious symbols tied to land, fertility, and maternal blessing cannot be driven out by argument alone. They answer to fears argument seldom touches. That is why prophets shout, kings legislate, and reformers burn. Asherah survives because she lives where policy cannot easily reach, in longing, in memory, and in the old intuition that life should have a motherly shelter somewhere above it.